Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I just want to let everyone know that this event is being recorded, and the recording will be available after today's webinar. We'll be sending it out in a follow-up email. I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar today on data inventory best practices. We'll dive into data inventory, what it is, the benefits of it, and the industry trends that we're seeing. I'm Laura Zawacki, the moderator for today's webinar event, and today we're joined by Gregory and Ben Piercey. Greg is one of Bishop's senior solution architects and has over 25 years of experience in IT, focused primarily on data management and information governance. He currently assists Bishop clients with strategies to address data protection, storage reduction, and litigation readiness, and previously held subject matter expert positions at several tech organizations. We also have Ben Piercey here from Acaveo. He's the CTO. And Acaveo is a leader in file analysis software that empowers organizations with an actionable understanding of their unstructured data. Ben is responsible for the development and execution of Acaveo's technology vision, and he brings over 20 years of technical expertise, including high-performance network computing, cloud collaboration and file sharing, desktop software, web services, and enterprise information security. His experience includes software development, systems architecture, development operations, and product management. We'll be saving questions for the end of the presentation, but you can submit your questions anytime throughout in the Q&A or the chat areas of WebEx. We'll also review a special offer for everyone on today's event, so make sure to stick around until the end. And Greg, at this point, I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Inventory and why you need it, and most notably the massive growth of storage continues unabated, and finding out a way to handle that is an important attribute for most organizations going forward. E-discovery and audit and compliance are not slowing down, and a lot of folks like to think about deploying some kind of information governance strategy and policies, but it's very difficult to do. So we're going to look at maybe some of the first steps of how you can get going on that kind of a initiative. And then we'll take it into an interview Q&A session where Ben and I will discuss some of the topics of relevance in the industry today and add in your questions as well. So Bishop Technologies has actually been in the information and data management space for over a decade. We've specialized in helping organizations deploy and manage information management solutions such as EAS and other archiving products, e-discovery products, and we've also helped many organizations move from legacy systems into newer information governance platforms, as well as moving data into Office 365 in large volume. Ben, I think if you would like to share a couple comments regarding Acaveo. Obviously, they're a leader now in a new file analysis space and considered a cool vendor by Gartner, but I don't know if, Ben, if you have a couple of bullet points you'd like to add.
Yeah, sure. So Acaveo is a enterprise software product company based in Ottawa, Canada. We've been around since 2012. And in that time, we've been living and breathing unstructured data. We've been helping numerous companies deal with the characteristics and the growth of their data, and really helping them get visibility into what they have and helping them manage that data as well.
Thanks very much. So I think one of the things that people need to understand is, what is this idea of a data inventory? And really, it's understanding what is out there. I think in the face of the massive storage growth that people have experienced over the last decade, and in many cases, the content is stored in multiple separate silos. There's no policies involved. It's really building a catalog or a map of all of the information that you have, so that you understand, what type of data are you actually storing? Do you have potentially information that you don't need to store, or perhaps isn't even appropriate to store, PCI-related information or people's personal MP3 collections, things like that. It's also important to understand who actually has ownership of that data and how much is an individual group using, so that hopefully you can get some traction on recouping some of the costs of storing this information. And then last but not least, how old is this information and when was it last accessed? Is it even useful, viable information anymore? It may, maybe it is owned by somebody who doesn't even work for your organization anymore. And really it's the first step to implementing any kind of policy or strategy. I know of a lot of organizations in the decade or so that I've been working in data management, information governance, that they've been planning to implement some kind of retention and disposition policies for that entire length of time, and for whatever reason, it's very difficult to actually pull the trigger on a policy. A big portion of that problem is because you don't actually have a good understanding of what you have. So performing the data inventory is that initial step to understand, hey, where are some maybe target-rich environments that we can look at and put in a legally defensible process for at least moving that data out of its primary storage location where the costs are highest, and potentially move that to a lower cost tier or eventually actually dispose of the data. One of the challenges that we're seeing nowadays is not just the actual cost of the storage and the cost of managing that storage in terms of backup and DR, but there's additional complexities now around where that data is stored, both on premises and in the cloud. Obviously, users want to have ubiquitous access to all of their information now, so various file sync and share utilities are in use, like Dropbox and others, and people are now scattering that data even wider than it was before. There's more complex data types, not just Office Productivity Suite files anymore, so understanding what some of that content actually means. And then security concerns have become a much bigger issue nowadays with all of the various data breaches that have occurred. Understanding who has access to what data and making sure that it's locked down is critical. And finally, compliance and e-discovery is really not so much a buzzword anymore. Real audits are happening. People are not just looking for the smoking gun in email anymore. They're looking across SharePoint, wiki, and blog data and other types of communications, as well as the actual content that may have been shared through enterprise file sync and share. So it's a broader landscape with more pressures on IT, and right now I think in many cases IT is just trying to keep pace with the amount of data that's coming in, rather than getting a handle on how to address the best possible policy around that data. When we talk about e-discovery and audit, oftentimes, if you're familiar here, this is the Electronic Discovery Reference Model, or EDRM. I think a lot of organizations have focused sort of in the middle of that section, like, okay, if I've been litigated against and I need to preserve data, or I need to produce it for the legal process, I have some kind of device like a Clearwell device, or I collect that data and send it to an outsourcing provider to do e-discovery on it. But really the model needs to include that earlier half, where you're looking at identifying what data you have and putting that policy in there. And there's not a lot of good tools to actually identify what's already out there beyond what may be in say, an email archive. And so understanding that left-hand side of the spectrum is actually probably more critical and is more cost-effective than focusing on the actual legal review and production aspect of the EDRM. Again, we're talking about data that's spread out across many repositories, and I know that there's a lot of organizations that in the past have looked at using traditional e-discovery type tools to perform indexing across a broader spectrum of their data. Unfortunately, that requires some very costly infrastructure to re-index all of that content. Wouldn't it be nice if you could actually leverage the native search indexes that are now built into a lot of the platforms like Exchange and SharePoint and even in file system data. It's also important to actually understand the integration with Active Directory user objects and permissions and groups, to understand inherited permissions and understand real ownership and visibility into the data, not just the simple metadata that's in the say, a file share. We need to understand how these group memberships and permissions have changed over time. And then finally, being able to, in a single pane of glass, look at these multiple federated repositories and provide some interesting queries to help to identify some of this information and who owns it, all in one interface is a very useful capability that Acaveo can provide. And then being able to continuously scan the information so that any new data can have policy applied toward, or at least have visibility, and then even execute searches on demand or as a scheduled process to identify anything that might be, you know, a PCI compliance problem or other HIPAA violations. Understanding what's in that data and where it lives is critical. The ultimate goal is to actually be able to deploy some kind of a governance policy, so looking at the lifespan of each individual piece of content with context relevant to that content, so that we make sure that we have data in the right place at the right time at the right cost. So we want obviously very highly accessible, very high performance retrieval of data as we're generating new content. We need to make sure that that data is secure and not able to be accessed by unauthorized users. We need to make sure that it's protected so that if it happens to be out on somebody's desktop, that we know that it's synced to a centralized repository or backed up in some way. And then ideally we want to be able to classify that information so that we can automatically apply policy to it and preserve and dispose of that data appropriately according to the policies that we're able to determine after actually understanding what information that we have in the organization. So with that framework, I'd like to actually open up a discussion with Ben to find out what he's seeing in the marketplace, what's really driving some of the initiatives that Acaveo has seen, what are maybe the first steps that we're seeing. And I think, you know, my first question to you, Ben, you know, obviously unstructured data growth has been massive for a long time now, but it seems like it's gaining a little more traction in trying to get a handle on it, trying to manage it. I know that Gartner has identified file analysis as a key initiative here in the next couple of years. Why is it really stepped to the forefront now versus in the past where it was kind of a, yeah, we'd like to get there, but now it seems to be more of a pressing task in terms of the analysts and what we're seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think you touched on one of the reasons earlier. There are two that jump to mind for me. The first one that you mentioned was related to security. I mean, you can't switch on the TV or you know, follow a Twitter feed today or pick up a newspaper without finding out about another data breach. So that's a major thing that's driving this increased or heightened awareness around unstructured data and its proliferation across organizations. Companies really do need to try and get a handle on that, and not just understand the threat landscape, but also, you know, what the target landscape is within their infrastructure. The other aspect, or the other major driver, I think, for this heightened awareness is around cloud. You know, if you look at organizations today are looking at their storage environments and having a really good look at the cloud and saying, okay, how can we drive additional efficiencies by adopting cloud? And so, you know, when you go down that process, you really need to understand what it is you have in order to understand what it is you can move safely. So those, I think, those are the two main things that are helping to drive the increased awareness.
So in terms of moving data to the cloud, I mean, obviously it provides a very cost-effective way of sort of stashing data. So I know that I deal with a lot of organizations that, maybe they have dreams of putting in some kind of retention disposition policy, but they effectively store everything forever. And,
right.
Leveraging the cloud makes that more feasible. When you say they need to leverage a tool like Smart Information Server, are they looking at it in terms of identifying maybe older, stale data that they're not quite ready to pull the trigger on in terms of deletion, need a place to stash it, or are they looking at it more from identifying potentially classified information, secure information that shouldn't go to the cloud, or is it a combination of the two?
Yeah, it's actually both. I mean, we see both types of scenarios. So you're looking for things that may be orphaned, like the people no longer exist within the company. It may be, as you say, stale, hasn't been accessed in years, but they're not really sure if they can get rid of it yet or not. So maybe we'll just move it into a cloud archive or something. So that's a very common scenario for us. And again, the compliance and security risk aspects around PII and PCI and different regulatory information that's covered by regulation they need to be aware of where that is. In some cases, it'll dictate what cloud service they are able to use, or whether they can move that type of information at all.
Got it. And what about, when an organization does have potentially already some data existing in the cloud in a box or a Dropbox, and maybe they're thinking, hey, I'm moving Office 365 and I get a bunch of cheap space there. Is there an analysis that they can do even from cloud to cloud?
Absolutely. So, one of the major things that we try to do is be somewhat agnostic as to where the data resides. So we have the ability to scan through cloud repositories such as Box to allow people to understand how much they have there, what type of information they have, and actually facilitate movement across those cloud repositories.
No, that's very interesting. So how, where, when, why are people approaching Acaveo specifically? At what point sort of in their cycle of determining strategy are you seeing people engage with Acaveo?
Yeah, usually we get called in when they're about to take on some major IT project, like a migration. They know they want to do it. They just want to understand how best to go about it. Or, an information governance initiative. Lots of companies are trying to get on that information governance bandwagon and move that forward in a meaningful way because of the risk reduction and increased efficiencies that arrive out of those types of activities. So really, they engage us to help them understand the landscape they have, understand the mess that they might be dealing with across their network shares. That's a common one for us. And, really what they're trying to do is come up with the decisions about what they're going to do with all this data to reduce the risk or to isolate areas of wasteful storage utilization, and actually to look for ways that they can increase the value of the data they have. These are all things that customers engage us with and use our data inventory capabilities to achieve.
Now, you mentioned migration. Obviously, Bishop does a lot of migration work, and the vast majority of the data that we're moving is going into Office 365. And we noticed that a lot of organizations, their initial toe in the pond for Office 365 is around email. It's something that's very well established, well known, and we usually get folks get all their archive data and email moved up to Office 365. But really where you get some of the biggest bang for the buck is actually in some of the other services, the SharePoint Online and the OneDrive for Business. That's an area where we're seeing the use of Acaveo is to help to identify some of the file share data, maybe it's home directories. Are you seeing Office 365 be one of the top targets for migration of data, or Azure blob storage, or is it more of a mix?
Absolutely. Well, we see both. I mean, different companies have different requirements for how they're going to store and deal with that data at the end of the day, and we typically get involved and help them get to one place or the other, or sometimes both. But yeah, certainly those two particular repositories are ones that we see quite often, and we can help facilitate the movement of data across to both of those repositories, regardless of whether the data is coming from old Exchange servers, even SharePoint servers that may be running in-house, or across their network shares.
Excellent. So can you give me maybe some examples specifically of what people are looking for? You mentioned that they're trying to maybe reduce security risk or address compliance, storage costs, and then you even mentioned how people maybe improve value to the organization. So can you give me an example maybe of how an organization would use Acaveo to reduce security risk?
Yeah, sure. So we had one company who had recently been victim of a cyber attack, where a lot of rather embarrassing information was actually leaked publicly, caused them no end of difficulty. And what they wanted to do was go back through all their email systems and network shares and find customer related data to make sure that that class of information was not being housed in places where it shouldn't. So that's one example, and we were able to scan through those environments and look for particular patterns within the content to help identify them, and then ultimately move and remediate. From a compliance perspective, you mentioned, there are a number of health organizations, particularly where we have examples, when they're dealing with their HIPAA compliance issues, and so we're looking oftentimes for PHI information. In fact, we had one scenario where the employees were dutifully doing their work of moving in this case sensitive medical images off of one machine and into a centralized network share where things were locked down. The problem was they didn't understand that when they were moving content from point A to point B, they weren't actually moving it; they were copying it. So you had this proliferation of data. The data still resided. Yeah, so we were able to help them identify that problem and correct it. So, yeah, I mean those are just a couple of examples of ways we've been able to help companies from both a security and compliance related way.
And what about in terms of reducing storage costs? Are we seeing people mainly doing some kind of tiering to cheaper disk, or?
We see a gamut here. I mean, storage tiering is one for sure, and the cloud, of course, is part of that equation as well. But a lot of it comes down to looking for things that just don't belong anymore, that are not required. So moving the stuff that you do need to keep onto the right storage tier is a big one. But simply being able to remove things that aren't being used anymore, or things that are just not business relevant. Like for one, if another instance here, we found again at a hospital large volumes of data being consumed that were actually seasons full of Grey's Anatomy housed on the network shares. So there are many different ways that we can help optimize the way that your storage infrastructure is being used. Tiering is one. Looking for stale data is another, orphan data is another. It goes on and on. There's lots of ways. Once you understand what it is you have and all the characteristics of it, you can very easily find ways of having significant gains in storage efficiencies.
And I know that one of the big challenges and one of the big focuses in the last several years that people have been looking at is trying to eliminate duplicate data, right? Everybody sends out the big PowerPoint to everybody in the company, and then everybody puts it up into their own home directory or a different file share, and you get, massive growth of data based just on the fact that people are distributing it through email. Is there something that your tool can do to address that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that we can identify as well. Duplicate data is like you say, it's very common for information to get spread around the organization through email. they land on somebody else's desktop, but they're also consuming space in the filers and the servers. Another one is sharing files through. You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation there, enterprise file sync and share. Those things are great and hugely convenient, but they also proliferate data that could be sensitive across the organization. So deduplication is another excellent example of a way to drive efficiency in your storage, removing those things. Now, you have to be a bit careful with those things. You don't want to be removing, things that are operating system related,
right,
because they have to be duplicated. So you do have to tread a little bit carefully there. But certainly, there are huge gains to be found.
Yes, key to have the appropriate intelligence in when you're making the policy decisions to deduplicate.
Exactly.
So you mentioned, we talked about reducing storage costs, but you also mentioned increasing or improving value, and I'm curious to understand a little bit more what you mean by that. So I'm assuming there's reducing costs, but then there's also getting some payback in terms of increased productivity, or are we talking about something else?
Well, productivity is one thing. I mean, if you're aware of what it is that's being stored, and if meant that information is available to people, the right information in the right hands is a valuable thing. And particularly, if you're looking again for around efficiencies, data that might have been associated with one user within the organization, and that person is now gone, may still be of value to the next person in their role, and so on. So, being able to identify the fact that this information exists can help drive, better value and better productivity for existing employees. That's one way that value can be increased by understanding what it is that the organization is storing. Another one that comes to mind is around chargeback reporting. I'm not sure if you have encountered much of this in your travels, but a really great way of again, around efficiencies is to look at all the data that's being stored and look at the way that the organization is consuming storage resources, and break that down by department so that you can go back to the department and say, hey, look, you're storing this amount, this much data. It's costing us X amount to house that for you, and we're gonna bill you for that. So that's a great way to keep organizations accountable for what it is they're storing, so that they're more careful in what they choose to store and what they choose to keep. So that's another one. If you don't want to go all the way to charging organizations, some people call it, a less stringent version of this, I guess, is called shameback, where it's more about just providing the analysis back to those organizations or back to those constituents who are consuming the resource, and allowing them to understand their impact, and hope that and suggest to them that they potentially change their ways and be a bit more careful about what they're storing and how much they're storing. So those are some ways that so those are some, I think those are particularly good ways. I mean, accountability around data is so important now. I think those are excellent ways of driving value.
Yeah, no, I think that that showback or shameback style of reporting is actually very intriguing, because I know when I have come across folks that try to put some kind of chargeback, or usually it's more in the form of quotas. You're allowed to use X amount of storage, and then when you run out of space, people just start wiping things out willy-nilly, and then they're coming back to IT saying, oh, I need that back. So it's almost like the fix is worse than the original problem. But
give me more storage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or the other issue around that is that you don't, as IT, really necessarily have the juice to enforce a policy or do the disposition, but if you can show and provide actual reporting to the various groups and say, you've got some stuff here that's 10 years old, no one's touched in 8 years, they can dispose of the data more easily than IT can. So I think that's a great area that provides value.
Exactly. I mean, this is what we're dealing with here in terms of organizations is that the proliferation and growth of data, it's a human problem. Like we are the ones who are generating it. We're the ones who are assuming that it can last forever, but it really can't. I mean, we have to shine the light back on this information and get the right people helping us to deal with it.
Absolutely. So at this point, actually, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. So if there's any attendees that have a question, if you could type it into the chat window, we'll go ahead and have Ben answer your questions. Laura, do we have any questions yet?
Yes, so we did have a couple that came through. The first one is, so once you do the data inventory, what do I do with all of that info now?
Right. So it'll depend, but usually what we see is that people are looking for, they're really trying to understand what it is they have. So they're looking for the distribution of data across different data sources. You know, how much is being stored in one place versus another. Which departments are storing the most data, or you know, what file types do I have that are most prevalent within the organization? Are those the things that I would expect? So that's sort of one area one thing that you can do. I mean, another big one is the age of data and access. So this is important for compliance and retention programs where, you know, as Greg mentioned a moment ago, you know, if you have data that hasn't been touched in 10 years, like, why are you keeping that? You know, you should, that kind of information is good to know, and it could offer some real gains. You can look for sensitive content. You know, if you're dealing with regulatory bodies and you've got PCI or PII information that you need to keep private, being able to know where that stuff is a big one. Lots of people, lots of customers of ours, that's a key use case for them. Again, looking for storage waste, looking for efficiencies in that through deduplication and removal of orphan data. All things that are useful. And you know, there are a lot of times, I mean, what you do with this information is it really allows you just to be informed about what policies you need to make. And for anything that you do decide can't live past a certain date, or you actually do need to decide to clean up, being able to do that in a defensible way is oftentimes very important. So that's another thing that we can offer, where it's not just a straight delete of the content. You actually have to get additional levels of approval, and those approvals and those deletions are tracked. So that's another area that I think people can, another way that people can make use of the inventory information that they have. And the last one that I'll mention is around data classification and tagging. So if you have large volumes of information where certain PII or different classifications of data have been discovered, you can tag that data so that you know, then maybe downstream security systems can actually pick that up as well. So there are any number of different ways and valuable ways of using data inventory information throughout the storage landscape of the organization.
So it sounds like it's really kind of an iterative process, right? You get sort of the big picture map of what you've got, and then you drill down on maybe specific areas or specific actions that you can take later. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's a key thing. That's a key point. So, you know, in many systems that are out there today, the idea is to pull all this information into one giant, massive database that contains all the text and all the content of all the all the files and all the emails across the entire organization. That's huge. The infrastructure for that is huge. So if you can narrow the scope of what you're dealing with and deal with it in an incremental way, that's a much more manageable pill to swallow for any organization. So yeah, that's a common way that people break down the tasks ahead of them, and you need to have the right tools, of course, to do that. And you know, that's something that that's the main way that we suggest people work.
Excellent. And so one last question on you know, what to do with the data inventory. You mentioned disposition or legally defensible disposition. I know I've got a lot of organizations that I work with that you know, they just can't quite pull the trigger. Acaveo does allow you to delete from source, right? But actually maybe keep a copy around in a, you know, cheap cloud repository so that if you really needed it, you almost have like an enterprise recycle bin.
Yes. We do have the ability to collect and preserve information that you require. So you know, you can collect it into what we call a vault, and we'll house that for you in our system. And if you need to go ahead and delete the, you know, go ahead and remove the items afterwards, you still have the ability to export all that information at a later time and get it back if you need to. So that is another capability that we have baked into our system. Excellent.
So Laura, are there more questions?
Yep, there's a couple more. And this is actually a good follow-up to that last one. So after the identification of the data and a cleanup is performed, what benefit is Acaveo providing after that point? So I know you touched on this, but maybe elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, so it's really about ongoing visibility at that point, and so we can. This is not necessarily just a one and done kind of interaction here. In fact, we suggest quite the opposite. We would really like to see that, you know, companies adopt this kind of data inventory analysis on a regular basis, because the visibility is always required. We typically get engaged at the beginning of a project, but we would recommend that the information be collected ongoing. And any of the operations that we had talked about previously, from defensible deletion, from tagging, or you know, deduplication, any of those things can be run on a scheduled basis and done in an automated way, ongoing. So it shouldn't be approached in purely a project-by-project basis. It can be an ongoing governance enabler for your organization.
All right, great. And then there's one other one. How do you determine who the owner of data is? We philosophically have an issue with, is it the creator or the user of the data?
So we have both. We have several different pieces of information, metadata specifically, that we use to establish data ownership. And what we do is we have a back-off algorithm that will look for, you know, if it's the owner that's actually mentioned on the file system, that'll have a certain weight. If there's a last author that we can resolve from the metadata, we'll use that. If there's a last accessor that's available through the metadata, we'll use that. So we have several different variables that come into play when defining ownership. And we have a weighted ranking algorithm that can be configured in your environment to isolate who the owners are.
And it's not just ownership, too, right? I mean, understanding access and permissions, especially inherited permissions, is important as well. Because especially if you're looking at it from something like more of an e-discovery standpoint, who had access to what, that's a critical way of looking at the data as well.
Yeah, access and ACLs are another variable in that back-off equation that we use.
Excellent.
All right, it looks like that's all of the questions that we have. So, Greg, do you want to go to the next slide, and I'll cover this off real quick. So for everyone on today's webinar, we have a special pricing available for our 60-day Acaveo subscription. So if you'd like to learn more about this and take advantage of it, you can reach out to info@bishopit.com to get further details. The offer is available until June 30th. You can also schedule a demo, or if you have any other questions, you can email them to info@bishopit.com. Another reminder, we will be sending out this recording and the offer information in a follow-up email, so be on the lookout for that. And I just want to thank Greg and Ben for a great, lively discussion, and thank everyone for attending. And with that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks very much.